child who are separated are women, and over 90% of non-resident parents are men. So it's a very gender-specific issue in some respects, this how the child maintenance service operates. It's very important that it works because of the children who are receiving it. So today we're going to be asking questions of senior officials at the department. Before we move on to that, I'd like to welcome Stephen Timms MP, who's guesting on this committee, who chairs the DWP Select Committee. And I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We have Peter Schofield, the Permanent Secretary at the DWP, regular at this committee. I'm pleased to welcome for the first time Arlene Sugden, the Director for the Child Maintenance Service at the DWP. Welcome to you, Ms Sugden. And Hilda Massey, who's the Director for Child Maintenance and Devolution Policy at the DWP. No one has one job these days, Mr Schofield, do they? That's a sign of the times. So I'd like to kick off with Kate Green, MP, please. Over to you, Mr Green.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to our witnesses. The reforms that were introduced from 2012 aimed to increase the number of effective maintenance arrangements in place, implicitly to get more money to children. Yet the estimated number of separated families with no arrangement in place rose from 25% in 2011-12 to 44% in 2019-20. Why has that happened?
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a good challenge, and may I say, I think the NEA report is a very fair reflection of some of the challenges we face, but also the progress that I think the Child Maintenance Service has made since 2012, and be good to talk a little bit about that. But as the report sets out, the situation in 2012 was one in which there were many of those child support agency arrangements which were not paying anything or paying very little. So what you've seen in the report sets this out, in terms of actually paying numbers, they are broadly the same in proportionate terms to where they were in 2011-2012. What was going on in 2011 is you had quite a lot of those cases that were with the Child Support Agency would have originally come in because of the mandatory arrangement nature of that arrangement. So up until 2008, for most people who were on benefits, they were required to make a application to the Child Support Agency. So within that number set out there, as I say, you've got quite a lot of unpaying or pretty unsuccessful arrangements. What we've seen since then, and I think it's set out in the report, is the new arrangements have achieved two things. First of all, you've seen an increase in family-based arrangements, voluntary arrangements, and the reforms in 2012 were really intended to support more of those, because the view very much of the government was that if you had voluntary arrangements, that was going to be more likely to be part of a constructive co-parenting arrangement. And then the other thing I would say is what you're seeing through those cases that are supported by the Child Maintenance Service, the new statutory scheme, what we're seeing is increasing numbers of cases coming through, and of those cases paying more money in each case, and you'll see that in the report. So we're seeing better quality coming through.
But would it be the case to say, therefore, that you're proving successful and perhaps increasingly successful in dealing with parents who broadly are willing to engage with the system, but that the overall position is that more families, or a higher proportion of separated families, are not receiving maintenance or not in any arrangement? And do you think that's good enough?
No, let me just be clear about this. The Child Maintenance Service is there for those families that absolutely they need it because there is a parent who is not willing to pay. And that is what we're there for. That is what the service is there for. This is really tough work. And one of the things I just want to get across to the committee is my pride in the amazing work of caseworkers, quite junior caseworkers across DWP in Arlene's service who play this role in getting money to those families that need it. The second thing I'd want to get across is absolutely, I want parents who are not getting maintenance and the other parent is not willing to pay, I want them to feel they can come to the Child Maintenance Service and we will support them. We will get the money to them. We will get the money to their children. We will support them. And that is a key message. And what you have seen in this report increasingly is greater success as we've gone through time in getting more money to more families, and you'll see that. And our accuracy rate is higher than it's ever been at 99.35%.
So is it an objective of the department to increase the number of effective arrangements, maintenance arrangements?
It was very much one of the objectives of the department, absolutely, to increase the number of effective arrangements, for the state to play its part where it's absolutely required. But just reflecting on the fact that actually it's only, if you've got a mandatory element to this, if you're forcing people, then it's probably not going to be conducive to constructive co-parenting arrangements more broadly, on all sorts of other things that really matter to the child, for example, on access arrangements. So we want the child support system that we operate, the statutory system, the child maintenance service, to be there when that is the only way to get money to children, and that's the key thing that we're trying to do here.
And what monitoring are you conducting so that you know how effective the performance of the service is in delivering the government's objective?
So some quite effective monitoring, and one of the things that we've done that comes out in the report, I think, quite well, is that in the past, I think looking back over history, we've regarded a maintenance arrangement as being successful if just some money is being paid. What we've done more recently over the last 5 years is monitor how many of those arrangements are basically paying full amount as well, so over 90%. So you see those numbers in the report gradually growing over time, and that's part of the monitoring. So monitoring the quality, setting a rather higher bar, I would say, than was set in the past. Then you'll see the surveys that we've made. We do surveys of separated families on a regular basis as part of the Family Resources Survey. And then we did more recently, in the last sort of year or two, a survey of separated families more broadly, just trying to understand the nature of who has got an arrangement and who doesn't, and why they don't. And you'll see a lot of those findings set out in the report. Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you.
Okay,
I'll come back later on some other matters.
Thank you very much. Mr. Grant, Mr. Peter Grant, MP.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. Ms Sugden, one of the striking things that's come out of the written evidence that the committee has received for this inquiry, and it refers whether the submission is from an absent father who's unhappy at the way that he's been treated and unhappy at the assessments being made against him, or whether it's from a mother with caring for the children who's unhappy at what they see as the service's failure to get the money they're due. From both sides of that divide, people are saying that the way the CMS handles their case makes it more difficult for the separated couple to live amicably their own lives. Does that concern you, that you're having that impact, first of all on the separated couple, but clearly that has an impact on their children?
Mr. Grant, can I just sort of step in first? Just to emphasise that everything we're trying to do is to support constructive co-parenting. And so when you get in touch with the service in the first place using the option system, the option service, or indeed if you go online, what we're trying to do first of all is to encourage people to make those arrangements themselves and to enter into constructive conversations, not just about child maintenance, because whether child maintenance paid is, let's say, often reflective of the nature of the relationship that the two parents might have with each other more broadly. And also we're doing a lot of work with other departments and other agencies just to play our part into a wider conversation about how we create the conditions for separating couples to work constructively and amicably in the parenting of their kids going forward. So I want to get that point across, but I mean, Arlene, you might want to answer this specific question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Grant. So absolutely it concerns us. I think if you spent any time with the child maintenance team, you would see that we really care about our customer base. We focus very much on the children at the heart of an arrangement, and we try to operate as best we can, absolutely, in a non-biased way. Done lots of training with our colleagues around that. We're now going into our 5th round of soft skills training again. It's something we do annually on a whole topic of themes that help our colleagues understand and how to react to conflict in a relationship, abuse in a relationship, trade-offs that go on, and arguments about shared care sometimes, which is really difficult to handle. And we, our colleagues will stick to the rules of that set out in legislation and try to arbitrate as best they can and set up an arrangement that works for a family. But at the end of the day, if we can't get a paying arrangement, then we will go down, obviously, the enforcement route. But in terms of how that presents and the interactions we have with customers, I just want to reassure the committee we honestly, genuinely care about our customer base and try our best to arbitrate as much as we can in what is sometimes quite a conflicting situation.
Yeah, I don't think MD's querying what it is that you want to achieve and what it is you're trying to achieve. But the fact is that the evidence that has been submitted to us by some of your customers or ex-customers suggests that you may actually be having the opposite effect in some cases. Should we treat those submissions, or that aspect, those submissions, as being a small number of atypical cases? Or do you have any concerns that the experience that they've had has been shared by a lot of other couples who maybe didn't bother to write into us?
I mean, I would say that, I mean, in an enforcing situation, I would imagine, and we see, a paying parent will be unhappy because we've had to go down an enforcement route. Now, that might present itself to you as someone feeling unfairly treated by the child maintenance service. But the converse of that...
we're not talking just now about whether they feel they've been unfairly treated. These are people who have been on either side of sometimes an acrimonious breakup, and they think that the way that the child maintenance service has treated both partners makes it harder for them to be nice to each other in the future. What I'm trying to get at, is that just a small number of cases that are atypical, or is it something that is happening too regularly? Are you actually unintentionally
I would say it's
doing the opposite of what you
a
intended?
small number of cases, and I'm very happy
it's probably rare to say that there's situations where both couples in a single arrangement are complaining equally of the child maintenance service. What we tend to find is, you know, as you could understand, you know, there's one...
I'm sorry, Mr. Schofield, but again, I'm not talking about whether they're satisfied at the result or satisfied at communication and so on. There's something that is possibly the only area on which both sets of parents, both sets of evidence we've got appears to agree. But if I can go back to Ms. Sugden, what do you do, say, a year or two after you've closed a case? Do you ever go back to both parents and say, now that you've had time to think about it, first of all, do you now think that it was fair? And second, has it made it more or less likely that you'll be able to have some kind of reasonable relationship with each other?
So when we close a case, we generally do not go back to a customer thereafter. It's usually closed for, and we would explore the reasons for that case closing. In that sense, we generally don't go back and ask for any reflections on that. There's plenty of people as well, couples paying that then go off and have a family-based arrangement. So there's equally as much, you know, I'd say even more evidence where a family might close a case because it's actually working for them now, and they don't need the service any longer because it has actually brought them together. The arrangements are working for them. So there's as equal as, or I would say as much evidence of that we see as well, and the reasons why a family might close a case.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, to Mr. Stephen Timms, MPH.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just go back to the conversation you were having with Kate Green a minute ago? The NAO tells us, I think based on your research, the survey that you mentioned, that 350,000 parents with care don't have maintenance arrangements of any kind but would like one. I think the NAO feels we don't really know why that is. What does the department know about why those people don't have arrangements at the moment?
Well, I mean, some of this is set out in the report as best we could identify in the survey that we did a couple of years or a year or two ago. You know, in some cases it is because of a lack of awareness, and that's one of the points that the NAO report pulls out. And so we are doing quite a lot of work to try and raise levels of awareness. And you think about sort of two groups. I mean, there's those groups that should be, you know, where they do need the support of the statutory scheme because one parent won't be paying. And in that situation, we've been particularly using the Job Centre network to help that network to be a good interface with vulnerable people who might need that support. So,
can you tell us a bit more about how you're doing that? How are you using the Job Centres?
Yeah, so sure. So we've basically been training our work coaches to know about the child maintenance service and what it does. And indeed, afterwards, we then surveyed those who'd done the training, all our work coaches actually, to find out whether they knew more about the child maintenance survey as a result of that. So that means that in conversations that they're having as part of their normal universal credit conversations or work search review conversations or part of the claimant commitment, as they get to know the individual, so that at that point they can have a conversation about child maintenance. So this is something we've done more recently, and I think this will make quite a big difference going forward. There's also what we're doing in terms of the accessibility of the child maintenance options system, which is what you phone when you're looking at what the options are available to you as a separating couple. And we put much more online, and the transformation journey that we're on that gets a bit of a reference in the report is all about increasing people's information about the services that are available to them. Now, you're right. Then you look at that number of people. In fact, I look at the people who say they don't want an arrangement as well and say, well, why is that? Do they have a good enough understanding about what's going on and what we can do for them on that setting as well? But we want to make a difference. What we are seeing, and I think this is something that's has happened over the last 2 or 3 years since we finally closed the Child Support Agency cases, so the end of 2018. We've had much more opportunity to focus on things like building awareness and growing the caseload. So the numbers are going up all the time, and even since the numbers that you've got in the report, the latest numbers I've seen show increasing numbers of people having arrangements with the child maintenance service. So we're seeing progress,
okay.
but it's a fair challenge in the report.
The NAO also makes the point that the child maintenance service doesn't seem to be very well integrated with other parts of the department. Job centres, for example, though I take the point that perhaps that's being changed now, you're addressing that. Universal credit, integration with universal credit, we're going to come back to later on. But the reducing parental conflict programme as well, CMS doesn't seem to be well integrated with. I mean, is there work to be done and indeed being done about integrating this service more fully with the rest of the department?
Yeah, and I might bring Hilda in on this as well, because actually I don't think it's just with the department, to be fair, Mr. Timms. I think it's how do we interact even better with other parts of government and other programmes, like the Supported Families programme and the Families Hub programme run by the Department for Education. Supported Families, obviously, DLUC, their programme, and programmes through the Ministry of Justice. So there is more to be done. I mean, the key point I would I'll hand to Hilda in a minute, but the key point I would want to get across is that child maintenance and the success of child maintenance arrangements, you've got to see that in the overall landscape of what we can do to support constructive co-parenting all the time, and that's the perspective to bring on this. But Hilda, do you want to add to that?
Thanks, Ms. Massey. So there is a lot happening in the wider landscape that we are looking at and thinking about how we can interact with other government departments and indeed within DWP on things like the Reducing Parental Conflict programme, to see where the touch points are, where people are interacting with us and with other initiatives, to help provide information and signposting towards people so that they can think about making family-based arrangements or, if necessary, moving towards a statutory scheme. And in terms of the initiatives that we're engaging with at the moment, there is the Family Hubs programme, which we see as a real opportunity, actually, as that rolls out, to ensure that they have the information and signposting available to people so they can think about child maintenance arrangements. MOJ also are trialling a family mediation programme that we're talking to them about to see how we can engage with that, to understand whether or not there's more we can do to signpost people to child maintenance arrangements as well. And then there are wider programmes such as the Supporting Families initiative, where they're not specifically targeted at separated families, but they are dealing with families who have complex or specific needs, and where if we can work with them, we may be able to help people who, once they've been through the programmes, may be in a better position to make child maintenance arrangements. And indeed, on the Supporting Families initiative, the department actually has Supporting Families employment advisors in 307 job centres, and they have had training similar to the training that Peter was describing about child maintenance, to try and raise awareness and start to play the child maintenance issues into the discussions that they're having with people. And similarly, with the Reducing Parental Conflict programme, we are working with the programme to try and provide materials through the options service to help people who are in conflict to resolve the conflict and put them in a better position to then be able to engage thinking about child maintenance arrangements.
So you do want to plug the child maintenance system more fully into what else is happening?
The aim is to raise awareness.
When the changes were launched in 2012, it was made clear that they were part of a wider set of cross-government measures, which in the end, I think we right to say, didn't quite materialise in the form, at least not the form that was originally envisaged. Why was that?
I think the way I would characterise it is the reforms weren't landed in a static environment. There's been lots of changes in terms of cross-government policy, departmental responsibilities, and indeed a lot of the evidence around what actually really helps people, particularly families with complex needs. So as that evidence has been emerging, some of the approaches that we've taken have changed. So, for example, we in the department have moved on from a trial that we had around help and support for separated families to focus more on the reducing parental conflict aspects, because we felt that was more likely to produce outcomes and improve outcomes for children. So I think there's been quite a complex landscape that's evolved, and as it's evolved, we've tried to keep up with it and plug into what is now happening.
Does the department have a role in sort of leading initiatives in this area across government and sort of pulling, encouraging, cajoling others to do what's needed?
I think we have a role in identifying what is happening across government and making sure that we are plugging in where it's appropriate to do it.
What's happening?
I think it depends, because not all of these initiatives are actually directly related to separated families per se, but we certainly have a role in understanding what's happening and making sure that we are engaging where it's appropriate to do so.
The two departments that would probably have a bigger role than us are Department for Education through the Families Hub programme, because I think that is an important way of bringing a load of services together for individuals, and also DLUC on the Supported Families programme, and all that's building on the learning from the Troubled Families Initiative over a number of years.
Mr. Timms.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Peter Grant, MP, back to you.
Thank you, Chair. If I can come back to you, Ms Sugden, I want to look at the action that's been taken on, or has been taken on pursuing arrears from the former Child Support Agency. The NEO have repeatedly reported that arrears figures for CSA payments are not reliable, and I think you've accepted that. Why do you continue to chase parents for arrears if you know that the information in which those arrears are based might not be accurate?
So it might be helpful if I explain a little bit about how we transitioned the arrear across from CSA to CMS. So all cases went through a process of stable arrears balance calculation. Once that was calculated, we wrote to receiving parents to ask, in certain circumstances, which was legislated, in those circumstances we wrote to receiving parents to ask if they would want us to take the opportunity to try a collection again. At that point in time, if the receiving parent said yes, we would contact the paying parent to let them know that was the case and that the debt was moving across. There was 30 days there for a parent to come back to disagree with this stable arrears balance that we had calculated at the time, and if there was any disagreement, we would seek to try and resolve that with evidence, etc. But the balances that were moved across were the safest balances that we could create at that time, based on obviously the history of CSA and some of the issues that we had.
You say the safest balances you could create at the time. Do you accept that some of those balances were probably not all that safe?
I would say we went through a really rigorous process, and again, as part of the accounting, financial accounts, NEO audit those accounts every year. So they audited obviously how that process and the balances that they moved across. Could I hand on heart say that they were absolutely the right balance? Occasionally, we have had people come back to say, "I've now got further evidence to suggest that wasn't the case," and we will look at that at that time. But all paying parents were given an opportunity for any balance that was moved across to disagree with that and present evidence at that time.
It's worth saying, just to be clear, the Child Support Agency accounts, so the 1993 scheme and 2003 schemes, they have been, as long as I remember, they've been qualified by the NEO because of the inability to be clear about the accuracy of calculations that go back 20, 30 years. It goes back to the heart of the issues that the Chair was mentioning at the very beginning in her introduction, in terms of the difficulties that the Child Support Agency had over those early years in terms of the accuracy of calculation, keeping cases up to date, using the right data to process cases. So all of that is built up into this sort of hinterland of arrears that the process that Arlene described, we had to go through very carefully over a number of years, over from 2012 to 2018.
Thanks. I know that the NEO and predecessors to this committee, or former make-ups to this committee, have looked in a lot of detail at how the Child Support Agency got into the state that it did. But my question is about what happened afterwards, when this information came out of the CSO with all of the warnings about how reliable it would be. Can I ask you, Ms Reynolds, what assessment did you make of the human impact of pursuing people for debts, which in some cases they continued to dispute quite vigorously? They may not have been able to provide very hard evidence to justify their dispute, but there were still people who genuinely felt that their circumstances had not been properly reflected and they were still being pursued. What assessment do you make about the impact on those people of the action that was taken?
Arlene wanted to come in, but and Arlene was at the heart of that whole kind of process, but we were very careful going through each and every one of those cases, both in terms of understanding the sort of confidence that we had about the reliability of the debt. Also, some quite basic stuff around, did it make value for money sense for us to be seeking to pursue this debt when the amounts were relatively small and we knew that the complexity and challenge would be huge? I mean, the report sets out that we thought we might be, the value of the debt might be between 0.1 and 0.6 billion and cost 1.5 billion to recover. So we had to look at value for money, but crucially, as part of that whole process, we got in touch with the receiving parent, just to let them know what was happening and to give them the option, if it would be value for money to collect the debt, give them the option to sort of say to us, yes, we want you to have another go at getting it. So there were a whole load of different characteristics, but and issues here and criteria. But the one that you mentioned, the human element, absolutely was a key part of this. But Arlene,
I guess the other thing I would just add then would be when we did write to contact parents, 85% didn't respond, so that gave us an indication that many people had moved on.
So can we be sure that you were actually contacting with the correct address? You were satisfied that it wasn't cases that they'd moved?
So again, as part of the stable arrears balance, we're checking all the data that we've got as it transitions across. So yes, we would have got some letters back that they weren't at that address. We would have tracked a new address down and reissued that letter. So that was all part of the assurance of the process. I guess the other aspect I'd say that gave us an indication of how this was being received by customers was we got less than 1% complaints out of the whole process at the end of the day. So it kind of showed us that a lot of people had moved on and were accepting of the kind of the situation.
It's worth saying this process took longer and cost more for us to run as a department than we'd anticipated in the business case. I mean, one of the reasons why the cost numbers are not what they had intended to be at this, through the period between 2012 and 2018, is because this process turned out to be more complex, take more time and cost more money than we had anticipated at the beginning. But for the reasons that you've described, Mr. Grant, it was worth spending that money to get it right and to have the response in terms of what we've continued forward into the child maintenance scheme, but also the level of complaints, or low level of complaints that we've seen.
Thanks. I think we'll come on to more questions about the 2018 write-off, sure. And also sort of complaints and sort of user satisfaction later on. But I want to finish up for this part by presenting it to yourself, Mr. Schofield, that we found ourselves in a position where, because of failings in a government agency, there was a significant amount of money that might have been owed by absent parents to their ex-partners. Some of it was correctly owed, some of it wasn't. It would have been very expensive to get any kind of reliable view as to what was correct and what wasn't. Did you consider just cutting losses and agreeing that the government would take the hit? The government caused the mistake, the government takes the hit, we write off the debt, but the payments that were due to parents with care responsibilities would be met out of the public purse. And at the end of the day, would that not have been not that much more expensive than trying to put it right, and you would have had a position where absent parents who thought they were being pursued would stop being pursued, parents who thought they were owed the money would have got the money, everybody would have been happy? Was that something that was even considered?
I mean, the honest answer is before my time, because this takes us back to the decisions that were made in 2012. But the point I would bring out is that that quite a big chunk, and it comes out in the report, quite a big chunk of the write-offs were money that was due to the taxpayer. Because if you remember, the Child Support Agency arrangements were such that some of the money
but in fairness, about a building point of it was not owed to taxpayer.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So some was to the taxpayer, and I think about $1 billion was to the taxpayer, and about the remainder of the 2.6 billion, largely the numbers are in here in the report, aren't they? Largely to parents. So where we've ended up is the taxpayer took a hit, and receiving parents, I guess, would not have got the money that they might have felt entitled to. But then there was questions about the accuracy of that at the time as well. So that was a policy decision at the time. That this was the balance that was going to be in terms of how it was taken forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
For now. Kate Osman.
Thank you, Chair. I would just like to ask a few questions on the level of take-up and who it impacts on. Parents both with care and non-residents are less likely to have an arrangement if they are not working or economically inactive. And the same is true if they have a household income below 20,000. Mr. Schofield, how worried are you that low-income families are less likely to use your service and the impact this is having on children?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I want, as I said at the very beginning, I really want anyone in that position, to feel they can come forward for support from DWP, and whether that means helping them set up a family-based arrangement and setting them into that type of arrangement, or if there's a situation where one of the paying parent doesn't want to pay, that we support them through the statutory schemes. There are issues here in terms of how we raise awareness of what we can do and how we can make sure that we're able to support people in that situation. So the things I've described about the recent work through the job centre network, using our work coaches, the supported families, employment advisors who are present in many of the job centres who have a particular specialist skill, and everything we're doing more broadly in terms of training our frontline folk, both in job centres who see folk face to face, and obviously through the child maintenance service when they get in touch with us, to be able to support people in a very sensitive way. And think about people in parents in complex situations. There may be victims of domestic abuse, for example, and we've made sure that we've trained our people to be able to support families on that journey so that they feel they can come to us with confidence and we can put this right. But absolutely, I want those families for whom the right support is the statutory scheme to come to us, but also want to really encourage those that can manage a voluntary family-based arrangement to do that. So those are some of the things we've been doing to raise awareness. I hope that helps.
But it also seems that parents from some ethnic backgrounds, particularly black parents, also seem less likely to use the scheme. And I understand that the department hasn't conducted research into the causes of this. Is this worrying to you, and what is your assessment of this issue?
Yeah, it's a good challenge that's come out in the report. There are two issues, I'd say. I mean, one is we're increasing the declaration rates on ethnicity, so we're able to understand and get better data on this. This is an issue that the committee has raised with me in the past in the context of universal credit. In the case of the the receiving parent community, it's something like 75% declaration rate, which is good, and it puts us in a good position for that. We don't have any research on this at the moment. It looks as if when you control for income, this is my understanding looking in on this, certainly the way I read the NAO report, controlling for income, it may well be that accounts for the difference on ethnicity, but this is something that,
So you don't have plans to do any research into this?
Not at the moment, no.
And can you tell us why not?
Well, at the moment, our focus is on raising awareness and building this. And what we need to do is just see whether the work we're doing on raising awareness more broadly is seeing an increase in the number of people who are coming forward, as it seems to be already.
Well, the report shows that people are not using the service. The report shows that you're less likely to use it if you're not working, if you've got a low income. The report also shows that black families are experiencing conflict more so, and the children are going to be the ones who are not going to be benefiting from this. and your role is to fight against poverty. Your role is to ensure that, you know, children are able to have food when they wake up in the morning and have lunch and have dinner. So, the fact that you're just not really taking this seriously, it's quite concerning.
Well, if that is the impression I've given the committee, then I really want to push back on that.
Okay.
You know, absolutely, we are absolutely doing everything we can to make sure that we are raising awareness, and I've talked to it already in terms of what we're doing through the Job Centre Network. But also, if you...
So, just stop you there, because you talk about raising awareness, and we'll come into more of that, and it's good that you're talking about that. I think Ms Osman's point's a bit subtler, that there's a group of people who are particularly potentially badly affected.
Yeah.
In this case, you know, we're talking about black mainly women, because they'll be the receiving parent. And we've raised this, as you said, on universal credit. You have a kind of lack of curiosity about who your client group is, and you're not planning to look at this more, because, you know, this could be exacerbating existing poverty in that particular group.
Well,
I mean, so you really got no plans at all to do more research into this?
Well, what we need to do is continue to increase the declaration rate, so we've got better data. So the data has been relatively poor. As the report says, the data is sparse. But what we are seeing is an increase in the number of people coming forward with those arrangements, and we'll continue to look at this.
You don't know who those people are in terms of their ethnic background?
Well, increasingly we are as the declaration rate.
So of the new people coming forward, what percentage of those do you know about who declare about their ethnic background?
I only know the overall proportion, which
it's
is
75%, which is better than universal credit. Okay, we'll give you that bit, but you don't know whether it's higher than that for the new people coming forward.
Don't know if it's higher than that for new people.
You've got any plans to make it higher?
It's a good. The committee is rightly challenging me on this. Let me reflect.
Okay, Ms Oscar.
Thank you. I'll move on. Miss Massey, I just wanted to ask you a few more questions around good practice. You rightfully spoke about different departments that are working with you. Do you have any good practices from other countries that you can refer to?
So we do look at international comparisons a lot, because it's obviously interesting to see what's happening in other countries, particularly given how complex and difficult this whole area is. It is quite difficult to make direct comparisons, because obviously child maintenance services don't operate in a vacuum. They're very closely linked to a country's family policies, their structural arrangements, their cultural background. But the lessons that we have learned over the years, I should just say, what we have noticed is there is a general trend away from more bespoke court-based schemes to agency-based schemes with calculations that apply to everybody, simply because there is an increase across the globe in terms of lone parent and more hybrid family arrangements. So I think the latest OECD figures are 17% on average for lone parent families, whereas in the UK it's 22%. So we are a bit above average in terms of lone parent families. But in terms of lessons learned, so we've looked at comparable schemes, particularly examples like Australia and the United States. So one of the big problems with the first child support agency scheme that was introduced in 1993 was that the calculation was incredibly complicated. So what we did was look at that example in Australia and learn lessons from that. So we simplified our calculation, copying their approach to banding and using percentages of earnings in order to do the calculation. We've also looked at enforcement practices across the globe, and as a result of seeing what's going on elsewhere, we've introduced things like driving licence bans and removing passports and approaches like that to try and improve our enforcement approach. And actually, when you look at it now in comparison to some other countries, we do have we have a set of powers that are probably about amongst the strongest in the world in terms of enforcement. So we do continue to monitor what's going on elsewhere. I mean, as I say, it is quite difficult to make direct comparisons given the different structures, but we're very keen to learn where we can, because it is a very difficult and complex area.
So of the 500,000 non-resident parents, is there any joined up work that you could do with other countries to be able to help and get some money from those parents who are not willing to participate with the upbringing of their child?
In terms of, sorry, I'm not quite...
Collecting money.
In terms of collecting money, Well, as I say, it depends. It's very difficult to make those direct international comparisons because some countries have their child maintenance schemes are embedded in them, for example, in tax collection agencies. Some are still done through the courts, so there are different approaches out there. We are learning where we can, but as I say, it's difficult to make those direct comparisons.
Thank you. We received a lot of evidence from submissions from families who said that they know that the father, in this case, had hidden income. So is there any work that you're doing to sort of ascertain when there is a hidden income, how to get the proof, so that can add to making sure that wherever they're paying, they pay more?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've got a very sophisticated financial investigations unit, and that is their job, to chase those leads. So when a receiving parent says, look, the paying parent hasn't declared all of the income that they've got, or there's something else that needs to be taken into account, they look at those and go into that in a lot of detail. I've looked at a number of cases where there's been some quite sophisticated investigation work to get to the heart of that and to identify where there's the scope to bring more income in and to reflect on that. There's a particular issue where you've got people who are self-employed who may pay themselves an income which we pick up through HMRC, but then there's unearned income through sort of dividends or whatever that isn't reflected through that. It is worth making clear that we follow the legislation in terms of what's required to when we do the calculation. But it's what the legislation allows for is the receiving parent to raise what's called a variation, where they say there's something missing here, and we then pursue that, and that's what our financial investigations unit do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Osmond. I just wanted to pick up again on the issue around ethnicity and the impact on ethnic background. I'm sure it still puzzles me that you don't want to do more of this, because if you can surely see a trend, if you collect ethnicity, you can see a trend for perhaps in a non-English speaking resident parent getting less because that's then not so au fait with the system, or you can, well, there are all sorts of other trends you could foresee. Does that not inspire you to go and do more research? You said you'll reflect upon it.
Yeah.
I'm just puzzled about that lack of curiosity. Because if you see a trend, then you can find ways of altering the policy or the approach of Sugden's team to deal with those groups.
No, sorry, Chair, it is a fair challenge. I think what we've done, first of all, is tried to build the data, the evidence base. So that's about declaration rates. The second thing is this question about when you control for income, is there any divergence? So it could be, we know, and the report sets out, we know there are issues here about income. And sometimes the issue about income relates to the fact that the receiving parent, and we saw this in the survey data, says, I don't think there's any point, because I know that the paying parent doesn't actually have any money to pay. So we know that. But look, you're making it, and hopefully in other contexts, we've talked to the committee about the work we've done in particular parts of the country where we know we need to do things. This is around helping people into work, particularly young men into work in parts of the country. So we will do. We have. I want to demonstrate that that's something we are overall sensitive to. But I just have not seen any data or evidence at the moment that suggests, in terms of access to child maintenance, there is an issue. But there's a. I'm just not committing to research.
No.
But in this hearing, but I'm hearing the.
I hear what you're saying. Okay, I'll appreciate it as far as you go. So, Ms. Sugden, from a practical point of view, when your teams are talking to people, do you pick up? I mean, you must, on a qualitative basis, if not quantitative, but pick up that you're speaking to somebody who may have more challenges engaging with the system, maybe frightened because of family dynamics, which can often happen, and in all communities indeed. Do you pick up these trends on the phone through your caseworkers?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess from the outset, an application tells us if someone flags to us when they make the application that they may be a survivor or a victim of domestic abuse. We would see that from the outset. Once we receive the application, we would talk to the customer to understand, how live is that right now for you, and we seek to understand just exactly the current sort of situation around danger. That's just from an application point of view. There's lots we can do to protect someone in that situation.
So what about in terms of their ethnic background? I mean, do you have caseworkers who speak multiple languages?
No, but we use the big word. We use an interpretation service that's common across government, and we would quickly access and if and make sure that we're tapping into the interpretation services. So we've got that particularly.
So you
covered.
would have, for example, and then we'd have metrics very easily on how often you use particular languages through the interpretation service. That would be quite easy data to gather.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that.
But that is information. That's management information that's available.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking. So there is actually information out there if you were curious enough to dig it out. Well, I'll leave that there for now. Over to Mr. Peter Grant, MP. Back to you.
Thanks, Chair. Obviously, Ms Sugden, I welcome the comments you've made where a partner declares that she's been in an abusive relationship. A lot of women who are in abusive relationships don't tell anybody, either because they don't realise that what they're experiencing is unacceptable, and sometimes because, well, they're too embarrassed or too scared to report it that way. What steps do you take to identify cases where it looks like there's abuse, there has been abuse, but that's not declared by the applicant?
So it would show up potentially sometimes, again, if they don't declare the application stage, when we're talking to someone, we would generally look for parts of the conversation that would indicate, very short answers, not willing to engage in certain things. We can pick up to some extent and start to explore it. So all our people are trained to kind of look out for that at any point in a situation. We would dive into that a little bit more detail to see if the parent was willing to share anything beyond that. We would ask about any concerns that they have about us contacting the other parent. Would that cause them any distress, etc. So again, usually the answers help us understand. But if a person doesn't share any of that, we wouldn't necessarily know, but we do try to understand that from the conversation. And then once we identify it, there's various steps our folks would take to kind of help support someone in that situation. And we make sure our folk are trained, obviously our colleagues are trained to kind of spot that, know what to do. If it presents itself, we've got various action plans that colleagues know to access. A domestic abuse plan, a 6-point plan in terms of any threat of danger. So we've done quite a lot over the last few years to make sure our colleagues are absolutely alert to the fact that abuse can exist in both partners, to be quite honest with you. It doesn't necessarily always show up from a receiving parent point of view as well. It can often show in a parent-parent situation too.
But I just want to get across, if anyone's watching this and concerned, if you get in touch with us and that is your situation, then we can do huge numbers of things to keep you, out of contact with the paying parent, in terms of non-geographic bank accounts, not disclosing address, not disclosing any details. We can manage that whole process. No one needs to worry about that because this is something that we put a huge amount of stall on. And the way that we've transformed the system, so now you can apply online, that means that you can disclose without having to do anything out loud if you're in a difficult environment, or maybe you don't want to say anything in front of your kids. You can do all of that, and if you're worried about being disturbed, on every page there's a button you can just press called Hide This Page, which will just wipe it from the screen in case you suddenly get kind of overlooked by someone. We do so much, and I just want anyone watching this who is worried about approaching us to know they can approach us with confidence.
Mr. Grant.
One of the submissions we got was from somebody who felt that the ex-partner's attitude towards her significantly deteriorated because she asked for a review of his finances, and the first thing the CMS did was wrote to him and said, your ex-partner has asked us to review. Would you still write in those terms if she had reason to believe that there had been a controlling and abusive aspect to the relationship?
So our records indicate if we know that, we would absolutely talk to the receiving parent first of all and alert them to the fact that we needed to contact the other parent, and would that cause any concern. We would seek to understand what that concern was, and we would make sure that in that contact that we are protecting the safety of that customer as best we can by saying, whatever's triggered the conversation, I guess, to understand income. We would not necessarily say it come from the receiving parent.
Yeah, to a large extent, we get our information on income from HMRC.
Yeah.
So even on direct pay, it would be an annual review that we would just do. We'd take the latest numbers from HMRC. It would not show up as a, the other parent has asked for this. It's just taking account of changing circumstances of income.
I want to come back to your last answer, Ms Sugden, because I welcome it as far as it goes, but that then raises a question: in what circumstances is it necessary to tell the paying partner why you're carrying out a review? Isn't it better, just in case either there has been controlling behaviour in the past, or in case the information that their ex-partner has asked for a review of them, that then provokes something? Wouldn't it be better just not to use that form of wording?
No, we don't go to a paying parent and say the receiving parent has asked us to review. We wouldn't use that language. We would trigger a review, but we wouldn't necessarily say what was at the heart of that.
If we do a variation, though, that would be, the variation would normally be triggered by the receiving parent.
Yeah, but we wouldn't necessarily say in an abusive situation that it come from the receiving parent. We would say we understand that, and we wouldn't necessarily say what the source of that was.
Thanks. One of the things that concerned me, because I've seen it directly myself on a couple of occasions, is where the relationship didn't particularly appear to be abusive at the time. After the breakup, it became abusive. I don't know what the position is elsewhere in the UK, but it's now a specific criminal offence in Scotland to exert controlling or coercive behaviour against somebody. A relationship has broken down and there hasn't been abuse previously, so you haven't been notified that abuse has taken place. The situation then develops, possibly insidiously over some time, where the absent partner is increasingly trying to exert controlling behaviour on their ex-partner, even from a distance. Very often in cases of controlling and coercive behaviour, the victim is the last person to realise what's happening. How do you make sure that you're not asking somebody to take steps, such as contacting the ex-partner, when they may be subject to controlling and abusive behaviour that you're not aware of, that may not have been present at the time the relationship broke up?
I mean, it would depend on the circumstances, to be honest with Mr Grant. So that we have direct pay customers who we may not necessarily be engaging with regularly because we've set up the arrangement to pay. So it would really depend on the circumstances and why we would seek to involve ourselves in a collect and pay situation where perhaps we may be enforcing. Again, we keep an open conversation with the receiving parent at any point in time for that person to declare anything to us. We keep them informed of every step of the process of what we are doing in terms of enforcement. So at any point in time, they can alert us to their concerns, worries, safety, and then we do immediately engage, as I say, the kind of plans that we have to help support us in those situations.
Is it actually appropriate to have a system that is based on encouraging people to sort things out for themselves when you know that a significant proportion of people will be deterred from doing that because of the reaction they'll get? Shouldn't we be looking at completely changing the focus of the system so that we're not effectively pressurising people to make contact with somebody when it might either worsen abuse that's already taken place, or that might be the trigger that starts abuse from happening? Have you looked at just changing the focus of the system?
Yeah, I mean, the heart of the 2012 reforms we talked about earlier, Mr. Grant, is this view that constructive co-parenting happens best in a sort of voluntary arrangement. So I think the question you're asking is how quickly can you move from a sort of voluntary type arrangement to one in which we are, particularly at one end of the spectrum in the control and pay arrangement where, this is compulsion from the state, and how we get to that, how quickly we get to that. And the report talks about the sort of the process we run. I mean, the legislation does require us to have evidence that the paying parent won't pay before we move to collect and pay. I think it's something like 10% of cases that come through the child maintenance service, they go straight to collect and pay. But in other cases, we need to build the evidence base. If the paying parent is clear at the start they are not cooperating, then that would be enough for us to put them straight into collect and pay, and we would pick up on that straight away. Otherwise, we need to follow the pattern set out in the legislation. But by and large, the policy objective here is where we can to encourage people to have voluntary arrangements, because of all that does in a positive way to the wider relationship between the two parents.
Thank you. I want to come back to carry on the previous discussion we had about the write-offs of debt and so on. Your department took a decision deliberately to delete records relating to write-offs before the National Audit Office had a chance to audit them. Why did you do that?
So the issue there, and absolutely this should not have happened, but we have a normal approach in terms of managing records that we write off, that we destroy records. Normal course of business is that you only keep records for as long as you need them. In these cases, closed cases, we were destroying them after 14 months. But that did not allow enough time for this to be taken into account in the NAO audit, and I know that, and this has been flagged obviously in the last set of accounts that the NAO audited. We have changed that process, so that can't happen now. But it did happen because we had, we follow normal business case approach to retaining records. You only should retain records for as long as you need them, and our standard approach across the department is where we can see no need to hold on to them, we destroy them after 14 months, and that didn't work with the cycle of the audit. So that's two things that didn't work together, but we've changed that process.
But surely as a government department funded by the taxpayer, public accountability has got to be very high up on your list of reasons why we might need to keep something. Why did nobody in your department realise that information about the finances of the department couldn't be destroyed until at the very least the accounts had been signed off and audited? Why, out of all the civil servants that you've got in your department, why did nobody say, hang on a minute, I think this is a mistake?
You can imagine it's a question I've been asking as well, and so that's something that we realised that there was an issue here in terms of these closed accounts. These were the historic cases and closed accounts, and we were going through the normal course of destroying them after 14 months. But you're right, they shouldn't have been. They won't be in the future. We've changed the process. We've made sure that in our department, where you've got different competing pressures, people have seen the join up. But it's a very fair challenge, Mr. Grant.
I'm looking at the kind of information that's going to be retained in these records. First of all, can you tell me, you've changed that kind of information from a 14-month record destruction policy. What is the policy now?
24 months.
24 months. Is that beyond the time where either parent might still want to lodge a complaint about the fact the case has been closed?
Yes, in our experience, and these are closed cases, so these aren't ongoing cases. These are closed cases where they've closed for, could well be that the child is no longer a child and is beyond the age where we would cover them through child maintenance arrangements, for example.
But we're talking about amounts that were written off during the last financial year, 2020-21. It's not that long ago. Are you absolutely certain that there's nothing in the cases whose records were deleted that might subsequently be open to challenge, either initially through a complaint, a request for review, or some other process?
Yeah, because the process for challenge, so if you're unhappy with, for example, a calculation, then you've got the opportunity to ask for a mandatory reconsideration. And if you're not happy with the mandatory reconsideration, you can take that to an appeal. So obviously, if anything is going through that process, then we wouldn't destroy the record. So these are cases where there's been time for any of those processes to happen, and the case is closed, and there's also been time for the audit to carry out now with this extended period.
Thank you. Some of the submissions that we've had, either from individuals or from representative organisations, have expressed the view that if a parent has left one family and has done everything possible to avoid the responsibilities towards them, there's a good chance that at some point they'll do the same if they start a family or get into a relationship with somebody else. Do you have a way of flagging up the fact that an absent parent who's beginning to default on payments or stop cooperating with the system, do you have a way of identifying the fact that that's a pattern of behaviour the same person has exhibited before, or does everybody start off with a completely clean sheet?
Well, it would be an existing case, wouldn't it? So I was looking at a case the other day, for example, where you had someone who was had a relationship that had separated, and there was one child, and they were paying through collect and pay, and then they entered another relationship, had another child, and that was and therefore the amount that we took from for the first child was reduced because of there being a relevant other child, and then that second relationship split, and then we then had to then make a further adjustment because they then entered a family-based arrangement for the second family. And that sort of complexity of seeing a number of different families all related to one paying parent is something that our people see all the time. I think it's a good question, and I might ask Arlene to answer this one in terms of, because I think what your question is probably the second time, so someone's in collect and pay with family one, there's then a request from, in terms of family two, from the receiving parent to ask for a new arrangement there. Would we go straight to collect and pay for the second?
Can I make my question a bit more specific? What I'm looking at, and it's following on from the deletion of records.
Right.
How do you know that you haven't deleted information that would tell you next year that an absent parent you were getting complaints about had done exactly the same thing, and the records have been deleted because it was 14 months, or in this case 24 months? Because in the life of an adult having children, 14 or 24 months is not all that.
But we'd only have closed it after the child maintenance case had finished, which would only have happened after, presumably the child is no longer covered by child maintenance, and the payments have fully been made, and there are no arrears. Because we're pursuing, we're going to be pursuing, if someone's not paying, we're going to pursue them. We're going to pursue them for as long as we can pursue them and get that money. The scenario you're describing is I think not one that would apply in terms of the deletion of records. But there's, and I'd want to reassure the committee that when it comes to second and third families by the same father, let's assume it's a man in that situation, then we would be linking them because it's all the same. It's the same paying parent in each case. And my question, I suppose, is whether we go straight to collect and pay for family two.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, when the application comes in, we would be able to link that to the current paying parent on another case and see that that's in collect and pay, and therefore that would be one of the cases we would immediately set to collect and pay.
Okay, so the deletion of the records for 2020-21, which you've accepted, shouldn't have happened. Can you give us an absolute assurance that that premature deletion of records won't have disadvantaged any of your current claimants or current applicants?
I don't think it will have. I really don't think it will have done. Look, if there's a sort of machination or complex situation that I've missed in this, and one of your, to the best of my knowledge, but if any constituent has sort of spotted something like that, then please write. But to the best of my knowledge.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. Kate Green, MP, over to you.
The NAO report identifies that the department hasn't estimated how much undetected fraud and error exists in the system. I think, Mr. Schofield, you spoke a moment or two ago about what you described as a sophisticated financial investigations system. You also talked about the reliance on a receiving parent effectively giving you information by raising a variation. How would you characterise the CMS's responsibility for reducing parental fraud or error, as opposed to reliance on the receiving parent raising the issue with you?
Yes, and obviously also the comparison is made by, I thought you were going to go in terms of comparing it with benefit fraud more broadly, but you might...
we may come on to that later.
You might come on to that more broadly. I anticipated the question. Yeah, exactly.
You're off that hook a little bit.
Or tax fraud, indeed, Mr. Schofield.
Regular conversation with this committee, quite rightly. What we see here is our most fruitful references come from the receiving parent, and that is often because it's the receiving parent who knows an awful lot about the paying parent's situation, financial affairs, chasing things down, but it is not. I mean, so it is the most fruitful route, and it's the one that that delivers the most financial investigations that we see. It's not the only route, because we'll also pick up through casework, for example. That's another route, and as we're doing with benefit fraud, we're looking at whether there's more we can do with data and analytics to get to the heart of things. The advantage we've got with child maintenance in terms of some of the parameters of fraud is that the legislation is quite clear about what we take into account. So it sort of sets out a bit in the report here, doesn't it, that 91% of cases, the income we draw as the legislation requires from the sources of HMRC in terms of real-time income, and also from our own benefit data. So that covers 91% in terms of income. What it doesn't necessarily show up is where there is unearned income. So we talked before earlier about the situation where you've got self-employed, they're paying themselves through their company. We pick up on that, but there's some other source through dividends or whatever that we don't necessarily pick up, and that's not covered by the legislation right now. And also, obviously, if there's falsification in terms of children that they're responsible for, or they could talk about children that they might have responsibility for in another family, which the calculation requires us to take into account in terms of how we work out what they're required to pay. So there are more limited parameters than, for example, benefit fraud. But we then have the opportunity for the receiving parent to raise a variation where there's some other source of income that we haven't necessarily picked up on.
Is there any legislative change that would be helpful to you in giving you stronger powers, akin to what you have, for example, in relation to benefit fraud?
In terms of the calculation, obviously, I think on Monday we put out the response to a consultation we did last week. And Hilda might want to say a little bit more about that, but that covers the sort of what we would take into account in the initial calculation. So taking into account types of unearned income in the initial calculation, that type of unearned income that we can pick up readily from HMRC, it's the opportunity for us to do that. So we've said we would take legislation as and when parliamentary time allows off the back of that consultation that we did last year. So that's one element. There's a wider challenge here, which the NAO quite rightly bring, but I think the way they've characterised it in their report is right on the basis of proportionality. But for benefit fraud, we do this quite comprehensive survey every year, just opening up thousands of cases and just looking at them, going into the heart of it. Did we get this case right? Is this person defrauding the system? Is there official error? We don't do that in the case of this type of fraud. It's fraud between parents. It's not the taxpayer. But I don't think the NAR is suggesting we do that big a kind of a study, a kind of similar thing. But they're sort of saying, is there more we can do from a proportional point of view to understand not just the fraud between parents that we detect, but more broadly what level of fraud is going on. That's something we can reflect on.
And where you might, for example, be identifying benefit fraud, is there a way of taking a risk-based approach that says if we already know that this particular customer is responsible for fraud against the benefit system, maybe we ought to have a look at the child support situation as well relating to that parent?
Yeah, well, of course, it's based on the same sort of system. So if someone is, what we'd be talking about here is fraud around income, I think would be the most obvious, wouldn't it? And so, absolutely. If they're not declaring to HMRC income that they should have, then, we'll see that too. And
so there's information sharing between CMS, HMRC, and your own benefit system and CMS in both directions?
Well, I think it's a good question. Does it work enough in both directions? Yeah. There's a very clear kind of route out from HMRC through to us and through to both us on the child maintenance side and universal credit. But I think we're just looking at what more we can do to sort of share the intelligence. So I don't know whether Hilda wants to say more on this.
I could just add in terms of the legislation that we're planning to take through. At the moment, the calculation is based on data that we get direct from HMRC relating to gross historic earned income. We're planning to also introduce unearned income data that we get direct from HMRC and feed that through directly into the calculation when parliamentary time allows. So that will become part of the standard calculation.
For an unearned income would be rent from a property that someone let,
potentially, or investments,
investment.
or so the sorts of unearned income that you would pay tax on. So HMRC will feed the data through to us in the same way that they do for earned income. And the reason we do it like this, and we use HMRC data directly, is to ensure that the calculation and the way that we operate the system is as simple and straightforward as possible. And that's partly because we've learned from the lessons of the past when we've had very complex calculations that have taken in, huge numbers of different bits of information that just got overly complicated, and the CSA at the time couldn't actually administer. And so the decision was taken to use information that was fed directly through to HMRC to make sure that was simple, and to ease some of the administrative burden.
Sure. I don't think anybody would want to see a less energetic approach to pursuing fraud just because it's between two private individuals than if it were the case of fraud against the taxpayer, and least of all in this context when the end losers will be children. So can you give us your assurance that that is the framing in which you approach detecting and reducing fraud in the child maintenance system?
Absolutely. As you say, at the heart of this is the recipient, who is the child, and the child needs the money. And so we are, our financial investigation unit is a skilled team that pursues all of the leads that we get, and we will look at what more we can do around things. Like I said, data and analytics is another source here, isn't it? We can potentially do more on. So we're building our capability.
Can I ask some questions now about direct pay and collect and pay? 90% of parents who join the child maintenance service initially are assigned to direct pay.
Yeah.
Would you say that that is a successful approach when around half of direct pay arrangements are either not sustained or are not fully effective?
Yes, I think the data in here is 58% after 13 months were still on direct pay, so it's, as you say, the remaining 42% were not. We're driven by a number of things here. Obviously, the policy intent in 2012, which is how the legislation then became framed, which is really trying to encourage more family-based arrangements on the sort of voluntary route. So even when someone comes in for a statutory scheme, we'd really prefer it if they then entered into that, although we do the calculation for them in terms of the amounts, the actual sort of management of the money between them is something that they do together voluntarily, because we think that creates a more positive environment for, as I said earlier, constructive co-parenting. And obviously the law does require us to, we can only invoke collect and pay. We can only invoke a sort of arrangement where we compel the payment if we can demonstrate that the paying parent is unlikely to pay. So we have to go through that process. But I think the challenge for us, and the thing that we really need, I know we need to work on, I think we do a decent job on, I know we need to go further on, and actually transformation and digitalisation gives us more opportunities for that, is to spot more quickly those cases in direct pay where there's no payment being made, and combination of things, for example, where we can nudge and encourage the receiving parent to let us know.
Yeah. Perhaps we can hear from Ms Sugden about how you do that.
I just wanted to add to what Peter said, in that direct pay is much faster to get money flowing.
If you get money.
Yeah, but I mean, again, we have processes in place to trigger and nudge and encourage parents to come and tell us, but it's more flexible. I think it's lighter touch. It works for a lot of families. Actually, in some cases, it's brought relationships closer together. And I think it's, as Peter says, it's one step closer to a family-based arrangement. Yes, we do nudge parents to tell us if it's working for them. We send text messages, and then we have the process of the annual review, where every year we are looking at the case and recalculating maintenance, and we're encouraging parents to tell us then if it's not working for them.
Yeah, but we know that non-resident paying parents are accruing 5 months of missed payments before being transferred to collect and pay. So why is it taking so long? 5 months is a long time for a parent with the care of children to have no money coming in to support them.
So again, as soon as a receiving parent comes to us and says that I'm not receiving money, we would seek some evidence of that. We would contact the paying parent. and we would move it to collect and pay if that was exactly the case. And we would do that. We give 17 days, I think it is, for the paying parent to come back to us, and then we would process that immediately onto collect and pay thereafter.
And what about receiving parents who are reluctant to come to you for the sort of reasons Mr. Grant was talking about earlier, that they're fearful of what that might do to their relationship with the paying parent?
I think all we can keep doing just now, I mean, through our transformation, we've now got our My Child Maintenance account. We're looking to message through that, to encourage parents to tell us, to reassure. We keep nudging to say we could step that up and do more nudging. But unless they come forward and tell us, we won't necessarily know. It's invisible to us if money's not moving.
The new online system, there's a very simple kind of click and to report that you haven't received a payment. So we're trying to make it as straightforward as possible. And I think even when you take the 17 days into account on average, it takes us 22 days in total to move someone from direct pay to collect and pay, where we've been alerted to it.
Okay, so receiving parents who didn't want them in the first place are much less likely to have effective direct pay arrangements. So is that not a factor that you should actually be looking at much more in this risk-informed, data-informed approach that you're taking in terms of determining where direct pay may not be suitable for a particular separated family?
Obviously we follow the legislation. The legislation is quite clear on we need to have evidence that the paying parent won't pay.
But the meta-evidence is that the parent with care is often correct, that they're much less likely, if they said they didn't want such an arrangement, for such an arrangement to be effective. Is there any way that knowledge can be built in to the decisions you make about what kind of arrangement is appropriate for these families?
The legislation doesn't allow that. I don't think. But sorry, Hilda, you might want to add.
It might be helpful just to explain to the committee that the reason that we put people into direct pay before collect and pay, and the reason the legislation is so prescriptive in terms of saying that there must be evidence of non-payment or somebody has said that they're unlikely to pay, is because the collect and pay service has fees attached to it, whereas direct pay is free. So it was felt at the time that the policy was introduced that it was important that everybody should be offered the opportunity, unless there was clear evidence that they weren't going to pay, that they should be offered the opportunity of a free service. In addition, of course, to the points Peter made around it being helping to encourage people to move towards family-based arrangements.
So what we really have is a system where ideally family-based voluntary arrangements would be best, but some families can't make those arrangements, and therefore quite a lot of families will try direct pay because that's free and because that doesn't cause so much bureaucracy perhaps for either you or for those families. But a substantial proportion of those arrangements fail and then they end up in collect and pay. So we've got a system where, as I said in my opening comments, we've got a very substantial proportion of families who are not receiving effective maintenance arrangements at all. Would that be a fair characterisation of where we've ended up, even if that was the legislative intent?
No, because I think that you're challenging on a lot of the right things here. The question is, how quickly do you identify where it's not working in direct pay and move people over? Okay. And when we move people over, they move over with the arrears that might have built up on direct pay. Yeah. So we then do. This is why we're always keen to sort of, to know quickly if it's not working, because we then do a lot of work looking back on bank accounts and statements and things to identify the total arrears that have built up since the person entered the statutory scheme in the first place. But those arrears move over into collect and pay, and then we seek to collect not only the ongoing maintenance but also the arrears that are built up.
Looking at collect and pay, I wonder if we could unpack your enforcement powers a bit. As of September 2021, only a third of paying parents who hadn't contributed for more than 6 months were being dealt with by the department's enforcement team. Why was that? Why the hesitation?
So what we do is we go through a whole process of identifying where it's gone wrong. So we're in a situation then when we've got collect and pay, where someone is not paying. Then we would take that quickly to the first stage, which is trying to seek to find other ways of bringing that money in. So first of all, we go to looking at whether we can put a payment arrangement in place, like a direct a deduction from earnings approach or deduction from a bank account, then we would, if we are unsuccessful doing that, then we would then look at the opportunity for enforcement action, so bailiffs and how we can do that. We need a liability order, and only then would we go to a sanction. So there's a whole step forward approach, and I think it's wrong to say that we're reluctant to move into that if we don't need to. If we need to, we'll move into that quickly, wouldn't we?
40% of collect and pay arrangements are, I guess, administratively enforced through deductions from earnings.
Yeah.
So that is not like legal enforcement, obviously, but it's administrative enforcement. And equally, as Peter says, again, before we go down the legal enforcement route, we would look at, again, administrative enforcement through banking, looking at bank accounts, etc., and putting regular deduction orders through that as well. They are cheaper and faster methods to enforce money faster than going down the legal route, which we would then do, absolutely, if those failed. But that perhaps explains, why not everything is in true legal enforcement. There's a front end of that, which we call administrative enforcement, which is faster and quicker to get money flowing. And 80% of requests for deduction from earnings works, it complies.
No,
so
I think the deduction
from
earnings is a very welcome approach. It's obviously not usable in cases where there is only
deduction
unearned
from
income,
benefit,
for example.
Yeah.
And in relation to the other powers you've got, you mentioned the driving licences and so on. To what extent are you making use of those powers?
Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, so that would be classed as a sanction, and falls perhaps towards the end of the process, because first of all we have to have legal recognition of a debt before we can go down a sanction route. So we have to go through a liability order first to get the court to legally recognise that there's a debt in the first place. Sanctions. You need to be able to demonstrate that the customer has an ability to pay, which in some cases means that we cannot pursue that as a route, particularly when you see some of the data around affordability and the number of parents who are on income that is below the tax threshold or on benefit. So sanctions you can only push down a court route if that customer has an ability to pay. Then if I take you down the sanction route, there's two aspects to that. So what we would look to do would be either to suspend passports or driving licences. That you have to demonstrate to a court that a customer could pay that within 6 months in order to get that sanction. Our preference largely is to pursue committal because you have to demonstrate to the magistrate that the customer can pay that back in 2 years. That has a greater deterrent effect, and I would say all sanctions are deterrent effects largely. We want the customer to pay to get the money to children faster, but we will go down that route if we have to. But there's a distinct reason why you might not see as many passports and driving licences, because we have to demonstrate to the court that a customer can pay that back in 6 months.
It's fair to
equally,
say
it's the deterrent, but we have done it.
But I was going to say the deterrence is really important here. Actually, I think it's something like 80% of these cases get settled before they go to court. The fact that we are threatening, whatever it is, a suspended prison sentence, removal of passport, removal of driver's licence, that is in a very large number of cases enough.
Are you able to give us numbers? That's a very impressive figure, the 80% that settle because of the threat, if you like, of a sanction. It would be very useful to know the actual number of cases. If you're able to supply that later, if not now.
Let's look at what we've got, yeah.
And Mr. Schofield, you mentioned a moment ago that moving from direct pay to collect and pay and then going through the enforcement route doesn't, of course, wipe out arrears. But we have a problem, don't we, when, on average, a parent who goes into the enforcement process will owe £2,200 before the action starts and £2,600 afterwards, because arrears continue to pile up, unpaid debt continues to pile up. What needs to change to address that?
Well, look, I mean, the key thing is just getting even better at chasing it down and enforcing it. So the number of things that go on here. I mean, one is this point about whether we can be quick enough at getting people in to collect and pay. So part of the arrears that builds up is because they've been allowed to build up in direct pay, and we haven't spotted that, and we haven't been alerted to it, and we haven't moved them across. As soon as they move across, then we can own it much more and get our arms around the scale of it and see what's going on in terms of the arrears and where they're and what needs to be collected and the payments that are being made. So then it's actually, I was looking at the 440 million of arrears that have built up since 2012 and looking at where we are on those. And, to a large extent, I think something like a third or so are being already, we've got the payment arrangements in place to recover them.
Yeah, but I'm more concerned not so much about arrears that we already have baked into the system, but the fact that even now, when paying parents are taken into the enforcement process, they continue to clock up unpaid debt, which means that at the conclusion of the enforcement process, they end up owing more than when they went into it. What can be done about that?
About the enforcement, the enforcement process, there are things that we can do. So there are two things, I suppose. One is avoiding a build-up of arrears in the first place before you get into it. But I think you're taking that as read. But those are all the things about spotting failure to pay and moving people quickly into collect and pay, and then monitoring that. The second thing is all the things that we can do to try and speed up the enforcement process, so you can actually start clawing money back more quickly. And there, I think the report sets out that there's been good progress made. We have reduced the time to bring bailiffs in. We've reduced the time for putting in things like direct deduction from earnings attachments. It is just important to reflect on the sort of the challenge. I mean, I wonder how much further we can get. I want us to do this more quickly, but some of the points are in other people's hands. So, for example, we can be very quick to put in place a deduction from earnings order, but then you have to then link to the payroll of the employer. So you might have just missed the payment date for that month. You then have to wait for the next month. You have to have allowed the employer to have time to put the arrangement in place. It's the sort of practicalities of that. You need to get court time in order to get a liability order. There is the time that it takes for our amazing financial investigation unit team to track down bank accounts and to sort of link them back to the paying parent. So there's a lot of complex work that needs to be done that which we are improving on and getting faster at, but there's also activity in third parties. I mean,
I accept that. Are you able to take a lead? Because from the receiving parent's point of view, the end-to-end process has lots of delay built into it. We have examples from the written evidence we've received from parents of non-paying parents moving from job to job so that the employer payroll system never catches up with the deductions. Yeah. Are you able to take the lead across government in demanding and identifying ways of improving that whole end-to-end process, where necessary urging other departments and other players to change their processes, and if necessary drawing ministers' attention to the need for legislative change?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one particular aspect would be getting court time, for example. And I mean, I think we've been working...
Well, good luck with that.
Well, but to be fair to our colleagues in the court service, I mean, we found them to be, I think this is fair to say, isn't it? We found them to be willing to find time and to sort of prioritise some of this within absolutely the constraints that they operate within. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. But I mean, but in terms of their willingness to cooperate with us.
And you see it as your responsibility as the department that owns the CMS to hold that whole government approach together and to spot where there are gaps and delays at every stage in an enforcement process, whether directly under your control or not.
Yeah, so if you think about the individual caseworker or financial investigator, I mean, they have got this case and they want to sort of see it through, and they're sort of looking at all of the different steps and owning them and trying to work them through. Whether, I mean, obviously at the end of the day, can you get the court time next week as opposed to the week after or whatever? I mean, there'll be other considerations. Sorry.
Mr. Green's really talking about the systemic.
Yeah, sure.
You, as the head of the system, and the three of you really heading up the system, are you ironing out the systemic delays?
I think absolutely looking at this step by step. I think the challenge, it's a really good challenge from the NAA, which is, do we see this enough from an end-to-end point of view from the customer? I think that's a good challenge, one which we're reflecting on. But I would
certainly add the liability order that I talked about earlier, which is the legal recognition of a debt, is legislative for us. And that requires you to take that to court. HMCTS have been fantastic in working with us, and I think the report reflects that, especially during the pandemic and then coming out the other end of it. And moving to digital courts, where we take bulk liability orders 100, 200 at a time to speed things up rather than individual court appearances. So we are making progress on the liability order part of the process. Sanctions, unfortunately, is a personal appearance in court. Again, we keep working closely with the court service to see if we can speed that up. But some of it is legislated. And we can't get away from the fact that you need a liability order to move forward.
May I just ask a couple of final quick questions then? Are you setting any targets for speeding up the end-to-end process?
So targets per se, I wouldn't necessarily say we have. What we are constantly doing, and again I'm delighted that NAO recognises, continuously looking for opportunity to improve. And again, a couple of examples are reflected in the report. So yes, we are absolutely well aware of the end-to-end journey. Can take up to a year, depending if you move into the sanctions space. Through our transformation piece, we are looking at how we might use better data, more intelligence to spot risk better, rather than the one-size-fits-all, which NAO reference. So, I wouldn't necessarily say we have targets as such, but we are looking at each end of the process and setting ourselves the challenge of how do you reduce it.
And just finally, Chair, if I may, in just picking up a moment ago what you were saying, Ms Sugden, about the use of sanctions as a means of actually encouraging parents to get back into payment. And I now have some figures here which you'll be familiar with. No passports suspended since January 2020 in England and Wales. 6 suspended disqualifications from driving, 2 immediate prison sentences. I appreciate exactly what you say. Imposing the sanction is not the objective, getting the money is, but it would be really helpful if you are able to give us more information, if you could put those figures in the context of in how many cases the threat of a sanction was made and led to payment resuming.
Yeah. So we can certainly.
In the last 2 years may have been less of a
that's a part of the problem as well. But it's a very we can commit to giving that information.
And I think it's very clear from the evidence we had that a lot of people are very frustrated by passing information in, and then the slowness of you being able to track that through on things like unearned income and fraud in the system. So I'm sure you'll have had a good look at the evidence, and we'll obviously make sure we provide that to you. Kate Osmore, MP, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I would just like to go back just slightly on the point of black parents and non-English speaking. If I could ask Ms Sugden if she would commit to doing some research which actually includes non-English speaking parents as to why they're not using the service, because obviously the more information you have, the easier it will be for you to find out where the disparities are.
Should we take that request away?
Thank you.
In your own work that you do, the Child Maintenance Science Client Service Satisfaction Survey, you put a rider in saying that people, what's the phrase, certain types of clients are excluded from the sampling frame for practical purposes, including non-English speakers and clients who opt out of being contacted for research purposes. So you can't really control for the latter particularly, because lots of people, that might scoop up lots of people, but the non-English speakers being specifically excluded from your research model is of concern. Can
we look at the request on non-English speakers?
I'm sure you and Ms Osmore, and we can have a dialogue with you outside the meeting as well as we prepare our report. Thank you. Ms Osmore, back to you.
Thank you, Chair. To Mr Schofield, stakeholders, particularly those representing paying parents, told the National Audit Office that low-income parents are significantly more likely to build up arrears, while 46% of parents using CMS are not earning enough to be charged income tax or have no income tax. They represent 62% of paying parents with arrears as of March 2021. So could you let the committee know how big a problem is the affordability of payments for the collection of maintenance?
Yeah, so it's a good challenge, and there's good statistics. Obviously, when we calculate how much someone should pay in any one year, it's based on their historic income. So affordability is sort of part of the calculation in that respect. I think the problem then comes when someone's circumstances change. They no longer have that level of income that was assessed. They hadn't, obviously they didn't pay, whether they were willing, whether the fact they built up their arrears in the first place was because they didn't have the money then, or they just allowed it to happen. But anyway, they're then in a situation in which, although the ongoing amount going forward might have been reduced to take account of lower income, they've got an arrears that are built up that they can't pay. And obviously the process that we go through, we look at whether they do have money, but if they don't, at the end of the day, at the end of the process, we then just have to take a monitoring approach and look at the and just keep under review to the extent that their circumstances change. So
but
that will affect whether we can collect an arrear. But we set the amount in the first place based on their income.
But from the report, it shows that 2/3 of those parents who are using Collect and Pay say it's really unaffordable. So the information is there. So would you say that you're using it to assist those who are actually complying? Because arrears normally happen because you can't afford to pay.
Yeah. Well, not always in this case.
Well, not always, it's true,
people aren't willing to
I'll
pay
take that back, actually.
Well, that's a big issue. But anyway, we've covered that already.
Yeah, some use it loosely.
But no, I just want to assure you that the basis of the calculation is the income, the historic income, and it's set out in legislation. We follow that. We draw. The legislation says we need to draw that from HMRC's records. Obviously, there may be situations, I suppose, where HMRC's records are wrong, and then we can, work through with that. But no, the basis of the calculation is how much someone has earned, and the challenge, I think, becomes where that circumstances have changed, and the arrears are built up they can't pay back.
So I just wanted to move on to the rate as it stands. So parents are now paying child maintenance at far lower incomes in real terms than was originally intended when the bands were set up. So why have you not updated the earning bands since 1998?
That's a policy question that they were set then and they haven't been changed since then. I don't know, Hilda, whether you want to add to that.
I can explain how they've got to where they are if that's helpful for the committee. So the research that was done in 1998 was actually research that looked at the cost of raising a child, and that is what informed not the income bands but the percentage on that income that the paying parent pays. So both the income bands and the percentages were originally set for the 2003 scheme. There was then a review done by David Henshaw in 2006 that led to the 2008 Act, and that was the last time, the 2008 Act, that the calculation was put into legislation. And at the time, it was felt that the bands, which are pretty straightforward and simple to understand, remained appropriate. And similarly, it was felt that the percentages remained appropriate. They were changed to reflect the fact we'd moved from net income to historic gross income, but and so were slightly lower, but proportionally lower in relation to the gross versus net income. So those key elements of the calculation were set in the legislation that was brought in 2008 and put on the face of the bill. A lot of there was very limited elements of that legislation that we were given regulatory powers on because I think because of the problems of the CSA in the past, parliamentarians felt quite strongly that they wanted to see things on the face of the bill. So they are in primary legislation.
Thank you, Ms Massey. So that seems to be a legislative thing.
Well, I think legislation, and maybe Mr Timmins might pick on some of that.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms Osman. Done.
One more.
Oh, sorry, forgive me. I thought you were finishing off.
No. Thank you, Chair. So I just wanted to ask a couple more questions. When a paying parent's income increases, their take-home pay can be reduced through the increase in child maintenance payments, reduction in universal credit at times, as well as an effect on council tax reductions. This can lead to a marginal tax rate of around 100%. How have you assessed this impact of this on policy aim of supporting people into work?
Yeah, it's a good challenge. And it relates to the fact that these rates are set in legislation. Obviously, the reduction in the taper in universal credit helps improve work incentives for people on universal credit. But it's a challenge because those numbers that you've described are primarily, I think, related to what's on the face of the bill, aren't they?
Yes. Thank you.
So I'm afraid it's the same answer.
Same answer. Yeah, we need to take it up within Parliament.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I just wanted to ask a question around the arrears. The outstanding CMS arrears are forecast to grow indefinitely and reach a total of 100 billion by March 2031. How are you planning to address the ever increasing arrears balance on the 2012 scheme?
Yeah, hopefully not. I think it's 1 billion.
1 billion,
in the numbers in the.
It's quite a lot of money, though, isn't it?
It is a lot of money. It's a lot of
Jokes
money.
aside, yeah.
No, it is a lot of money. I agree with that. And I mean, the point I would make is the 440 is the development of the point I made earlier. The 440 million.
Yeah.
When I look at that, and when I look at what we're doing with that, a lot of it is already in payment. It's under payment arrangements, for example, deduction from earnings arrangements. So a lot of it is in that situation. There's an awful lot that we're pursuing in terms of whether we can get a liability order, whether we can get a sanction. So, you know, the vast majority of it, we're looking at finding ways of addressing and bringing back. Less than 10%, I think, is in the category of, well, at the moment we can't see how the parent can pay, and we're just keeping a watching brief. So my point would be, the key thing, and what this committee would expect, we are, you know, looking at getting, you know, the vast majority of that 440 back. And even if it takes time, because, you know, the particular circumstances of the individual at the moment are that they can't pay, we would look to get it at some point in the future. Now, the 1 billion number in the report is a sort of arithmetic kind of, if you carried on at the current rate.
Yeah.
But I really would not want to give the committee a sense that we are, you know, that we're not. It's not. It's absolutely not.
I'm not aiming for that.
Absolutely,
that's what I'm just making.
Absolutely not a target. And of course, I mean, the other way to look at this is if you were to see this number in the context of the total amount of child maintenance that we have arranged since 2012, and that number is well over £5.5 billion. So that's 440 out of 5.5 billion. The vast majority of it, you know, we are getting already, and we're getting back, and we think we will get back. And that proportion, the sort of 8%, it was somewhat higher some years ago. So it's going in the right direction from a sustainability point of view. But I would want to give the committee real reassurance that we want to get that money back.
Just lastly, how much do you think you can actually collect?
Well, I'm not giving up on getting all of it.
Okay.
So will there be a charge on people's estates if they die?
We can do
Where
that,
do you
can't
fit in the line of creditors?
Can we
Sugden?
from their estates?
Yeah, so can we take someone's house and sell it?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And where do you fit in, if they owe money to HMRC, they're quite high up the list now, where do you fit in that pecking order? Or where does you on behalf of the resident there?
So that would be, again, down to the executor of the court and, at the time.
So you don't have, because HMRC managed to get themselves higher up the pecking order statutorily, you're not at this point?
I don't know where we sit in that pecking order at the moment.
Any plans for that in the new legislation? To make yourself higher?
That is it's such a good question. Can I write back to you on that?
We've given you lots of big challenges and good questions.
You're
trying to schmooze us, but we will pursue these questions and big challenges, don't we? Never you fear. And talking of pursuing big challenges, over to Mr. Stephen Timms.
Thank you. You're planning to digitise the service to improve compliance. How much are you planning to invest in that? And can you tell us what a digitised service will look like?
Yes, I mean, Arlene, you may have the numbers in terms of the investment. I mean, a lot of the investment has already happened in the current year, and there's a bit of money into the next financial year, the first year of the spending review. But no, the team were just taking...
So it's a two-year programme, is it?
It's 5, actually.
Oh, 5 years.
Sorry, Arlene, why didn't you answer the question?
Yeah, so
that's the woman who knows.
That's someone who knows.
So it's a 5-year programme overall, albeit the first 2 years have been funded prior to the spending review. So we found some efficiency within the department to fund it.
Which was year 1 of the 5 years?
So year 20, 20 to 21.
20 to 21.
Last year.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, last year.
So we've completed 2 years.
We're in year 2 now.
This is the end of year 2.
Coming out the end of year 2.
And then we've got the spending review period to kind of deliver the final part of it. So in terms of actual cash investment into the whole programme, around about 30 million.
30 million.
The programme will deliver savings out the other end of it, around about 151 million. But equally, what we are doing is realigning resources. So you asked the question, Mr. Timms, around what does a kind of transformed service look like? What we are seeking to do is modernise the service, bring in far more digital services to customers which are easy to access, and allows them to do some some of the simpler things themselves, so can look at their payment schedule, can see when their next payment's due, can send a message to us, can process a change of income, change of shared care. They can put these things into the digital system themselves.
So you'll have a kind of online account, will you?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So we have the apply function, which then leads into my child maintenance case. A customer is with us for 16 to 20 years. So a bit like a bank account where you can see a lot of the information for yourself when you have a banking app, that you can see some simple information yourself and you can transact. That will create some headroom for us, because we can then point our people and our colleagues to more arrears and enforcement type activity. We recognise in a redesigned organisation that would probably give us a 15% more capacity to improve compliance. Equally, if customers are processing changes themselves, it gives us the opportunity to automate it in the back end of the system, saving it having to go to a colleague to handle. That will mean that we can process changes faster and can enforce debt faster, because we don't have to update cases and things. So there's a lot around the automation of accounts and automation of changes. And I guess the last thing I would just say is a little bit I touched on earlier around, we've got a strand around risk and intelligence where we're looking to capture better data that will allow us to take different treatment solutions to different behaviour rather than the one-size-fits-all approach, as I said earlier.
We found with universal credit there are sometimes some difficulties with kind of everything being digital. Are there lessons from the universal credit experience that you can read across to this exercise?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly we work with Universal Credit colleagues. We have a whole service transformation programme within the department, because a number of strands of the department we're doing this. So yes, we have talked to them about self-service journaling, some of the lessons to learn from that, because we introduced the self-service messaging function. Yeah. Some of the stuff we're doing is first to the department, so we've introduced a web chat service. So, but yes, the simple answer to your question, Mr Sims, is yes, we are talking with Universal Credit colleagues as well as looking external to the department around expertise in other sectors as well.
Right. So we have a service transformation team under Amanda Reynolds, who I think this committee has met in a previous meeting, who look across the whole piece, including child maintenance. So we're looking, because a lot of this requires the same digital investment in underpinning systems that apply across the whole of the department as well.
You made the point to the National Audit Office that there is at the moment only limited integration between universal credit and the child maintenance system. Is that, presumably that's because of constraints with the IT systems. I mean, is it the universal credit system that's the greater constraint, or is it the child maintenance system where the problems are?
So the automation has been done, I think it's fair to say, on the child maintenance side. On the universal credit side, these are processes that are still manual processes that are keyed in. And the challenge for universal credit, I mean, there's always a sort of regular conversation about what you prioritise. And these are relatively few compared to the sort of volume of things, other manual tasks that have been automated in universal credit. These are relatively few. So the cost-benefit analysis of doing this now rather than doing something else now has been less. So we'll come to it. It doesn't mean that the work doesn't happen at the moment. It's someone in a service centre sort of keying things in.
This is the point about automating the deductions of maintenance from universal credit payments where the parents are in work or where they've got earnings.
Yes.
That's not yet been automated.
No.
I mean, are you able to indicate when it might be?
I don't have it. I mean, obviously the priority on universal credit at the moment is move to UC and the focus on that. So that's where a lot of the development work is at the moment. At the moment, but they have a programme of work to help to drive down the operating costs of universal credit going forward. So this will be. I don't know where it is in the system. I don't think it affects the quality of customer service in any way. Right. It's just a question of whether that's something that we feel has got for a limited capability or limited capacity of developer time. Is this the thing we prioritise today or tomorrow, or is it something else?
But I mean, given what you've said about automating the child maintenance system, are we going to get a similar sort of queue for things to fix issues there that we've already got? The one that you've just been talking about with universal credit, is it going to be the same sort of queuing system?
I don't think so. And the way we're increasingly trying to do transformation across the department now is to do it on a modular basis, so you can work on a number of different things at the same time, which is how we'll be underpinning the work on child maintenance. That's how we'll be doing things going forward.
Well, that was always the philosophy behind the universal credit system, wasn't it? But we do have this queue, which seems to be quite a long queue for things needing to be done. Right?
Well, obviously it's a huge programme that is dealing with many hundreds of thousands of claimants, and there's capacity we need to build for other fronts. But I'm sure we'll get there.
On these technical difficulties, I mean, we're told that you can't deduct less than £7 a week for child maintenance from the universal credit of a low-income claimant, and you can't deduct partial child maintenance payments from universal credit payments, even if there is headroom within the 25% limit that you're allowed to take in deductions. And I think that's, as I understand it, that's a legislative issue rather than a system issue. I mean, are those in a queue somewhere to add to the long list we've already got of legislative changes that are needed?
Do you want to say a bit about that?
Both, actually. So in terms of the legislation, we can't take partial deductions for arrears only because of the way the legislation is constructed, but we can if it's ongoing maintenance. However, we need an IT fix in the UC system to be able to implement that. So at the moment, we can't take any partial deductions.
Right. So that would be lawful, but the IT system doesn't do it.
It would be lawful for ongoing maintenance payments, but not arrears.
And does that require an RTI facing? Is that an RTI facing module within the child maintenance system? Would that be?
No, I think it's the UC system and the way
in the
that's
UC
constructed.
So it's probably in that queue. Do you anticipate forthcoming opportunities to do these various legislative jobs that we've identified this afternoon?
Well, there's a set that we consulted on last year, and where we announced our intention earlier this week, and that's around parliamentary time, I think. But those are the ones that we've been consulting on. We haven't consulted on other things.
Is that a child maintenance bill that there's going to be?
No, it's regulation.
It's regulations, right.
Yeah, no. So those were things that could be done through secondary legislation.
Right,
I think
I see.
In terms of, as we've, I'm afraid, shared with the committee all afternoon, there are a whole load of things which are in the face of the primary legislation.
You need some primary legislation, and you're not at the moment. You haven't got any of that coming.
We're expecting the Queen's speech soon. Have you any dates or options? Any idea when we might get primary legislation this time?
There's normally another topic that you press me on in terms of primary legislation.
There's always lots, but on this one issue, have you had any indication that it's even in the mix? No, not at this point. Okay, Mr. Timms.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you very much. So I just wanted to go back to earlier, Mr. Schofield, you talked about the interaction right at the beginning between different government departments and how they work together. And in some evidence we've had from Families Need Fathers, an important point here is made about just possibly one of many, but the lack, they call it a lack of coherent strategy, that some departments have contrary objectives. So in this case, the Ministry of Justice seeks to keep parents out of court as much as possible, mediation and so on. Yeah. But the Child Maintenance Service, and Mr. Sugden can probably explain this more, requires a court order if there is a dispute as to the number of nights a week that the children spend with each parent. So that's an awful lot of bureaucracy and court time and cost to prove that point. Do you think that's a fair criticism, and have you got any thoughts about how to deal with that and other similar?
I mean, you want to come in on it, but we do everything we can to resolve those sort of questions between parents.
So this is a rare occurrence, is it?
Yeah, so it's a shared care issue, isn't it? So that we would seek to try and get some agreement between parents around what the shared care is. If they don't accept our decision, one parent would generally disagree with the other, then that's for that parent to take up through, first of all, a mandatory reconsideration of our decision, and then ultimately an appeal into the tribunal to have the court rule on what the facts are.
Okay. So basically, in simple terms, if both parents are co-parenting in equal terms, that would count as part of their contribution in terms of maintenance.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and actually, I actually attended, because a lot of it's digital tribunals at the moment. I actually attended one myself a couple of months ago, where a paying parent was arguing about a day, which would take them into a higher band, and it went all the way to the appeal tribunal to have that resolved. And in the end, the receiving parent agreed because it was linked to birthdays. But I did think to myself, there was a lot of effort going in to get something agreed at the end of the day through an appeal.
It must feel sometimes like you're Solomon. I mean, you'd have to just, because there will be shared care arrangements where the days of will alter week to week, month
So
to
in
month?
this case, what was happening, the children's birthdays, they altered care each year on the children's birthdays. He was able to demonstrate through a roster, because he was a policeman, what his working pattern was, and therefore when he had the children, and was able, despite that evidence came out at the last minute at the appeal court. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's difficult, but we need both parents to agree, and if they don't agree, then one will take up a reconsideration or an appeal to try and seek some agreement if they feel
So
strongly enough.
lots of complex issues. We do. Okay, that's very helpful, because the shift working one is an important point too. And then there was just again referring to some of the evidence which others have referred to, but Gingerbread put some good evidence in, and this is particularly talking about the write-off of the arrears from the previous scheme. They say, some resident, if I can find the reference, a resident parent owed over £100,000. I mean, when you're talking about write-offs, are you looking at writing off smaller amounts if you're having to write off anything, or are you looking at it case by case? I mean, because that's a lot of money for a receiving parent not to have received for many years.
Yeah, so the write-offs, that was a special case covered by special kind of legislation. And we were absolutely looking at writing off those cases where it would not be value for money to collect because the amounts were so small, or because of the difficulty of claiming it. I don't know about that, obviously, about that particular case, but and the scale of some of the things that we're still collecting. But where we could collect, and where the receiving parent wanted us to do so, then we moved it over, and it's part of our regular enforcement process going forward.
Okay, I mean, it just be fair to say, just to quote it, Gingerbread has heard from resident parents who are owed more than £100,000. So it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't necessarily get it, but you're still determined to pursue particularly those large sums of money, just to be really clear for people.
Where in the case of those schemes, the CSA schemes, where it was value for money and the parent wanted us to carry on going for it, then we were going to do that. And
it's still hard. Even smaller amounts are very hard on the receiving parent and child if they don't get it.
Yeah, and so going forward for the existing arrears, we pursue all of them, other than the sort of below £7 points that were covered in the recent consultation. But we absolutely, and I want to assure the committee that we're absolutely going to seek to do that.
Though money delayed is often not great. Well, it's important, but it's not as helpful as it would have been if it had come at the right time. I just want to touch on the cost of running the service, and maybe I might be Ms Massey picks this up, but it costs at the moment 36 pence to administer a return of £1 of maintenance payments. And in 2011-12, so a decade ago, it was 35 pence to do that. Now, I wonder if you're happy with that general direction of travel, whether by now you could be doing it cheaper, or is the IT system going to solve everything? Who wants to take that? Mr. Schofield.
There are a number of things there. I mean, I think the report sets out that our intention to make the service even cheaper has been delayed. I think that was in part goes back to the conversation we were having with Mr. Grant earlier about the costs of doing the write-off and the time it took. It took longer. That delayed some of the savings. But absolutely, we seek. Well, I suppose the second thing to say is that because of everything in collect and pay is really a situation where the paying parent doesn't want to pay, and those are more complex cases, each and every one of them. I think the way Arlene has described some of the work we have to do, that comes at a cost. So you've concentrated the caseload on the most difficult cases are the ones that we have in the statutory schemes now, or the collect and pay scheme now. So that is part of the issue. But no, the transformation will do two things. It will reduce cost. It will reduce headcount somewhat, because some of the sort of basic processes of keeping a case up to date, all the things that Arlene's described, can be done online by the system. But also it enables us to shift some of the resource away from maintaining a case into enforcement. So those are the two elements of that.
So that's that increase in compliance, Ms Sugden, you referred to earlier.
Want to see, yeah.
So on that, we've seen challenges with going digital in lots of areas. We're seeing going digital. The Home Office is doing it now for checks on status for renting or for working for on immigration purposes. We're seeing the digital approach in lots of the benefits of a particular UC that you run. Have you got any concerns? We were talking about earlier, Ms Osmore rightly highlighted some of the impacts on certain groups. Are you worried that some people will be excluded from this going digital? Or with Sugden, do you have a plan to pick up those people who can't go digital?
Yes.
You're nodding, so tell us what you're going to do.
Yeah, so whilst we have a lot of digital channels now, we absolutely have an alternative channel in every case. So telephony is there in every case as well as. We recognise that not everyone has the bandwidth, has the ability, has the access. So the telephone channel will always still be there in each of our areas.
But what we also do is we just make sure we do lots of user research with all of the online approach. So we make it as straightforward to use as possible. And I'd want, as I say, many of the issues that have maybe been barriers to people coming forward to contact us on the phone, to actually find it easier, for more people to find it easier actually to do it online or on a smartphone or online in a different way.
Well, there's certainly a lot of evidence about the challenges of having to go through the case online when people are ringing. Is that something that you recognise, Ms Sugden? There are people saying it takes quite a long time just to explain where they're at with a case.
Yeah, so I guess over the last 2 years we've had quite a significant impact with obviously COVID pandemic, supporting the wider departmental aim of benefit processing. We lost a lot of resources as well back end of last year, the year before last, which we replaced. So we have a lot of new colleagues in the team. That has had its toll to some extent in terms of service. It hasn't been where we wanted it to be. We had backlogs last year which we worked down, complaints, mandatory considerations. I think again the report highlights that we brought in 440 resources to tackle non-paying cases. We're coming out the other end of that now, so certainly
So it's going to get better.
Without a doubt. So if you phone
You're new
now,
to this committee, but the permanent secretaries always tell us it's going to get better.
No, but I mean, if you were to, so on average now, if you phone, you wait 11 minutes to get through. So, you know, 80% of calls are answered. That doesn't necessarily mean that we've abandoned 20% of the calls, because, again, we have messaging on our phone system that asks customers to go online. Some people hang up fairly quickly once they hear that. So service is certainly back on track.
Okay, but if you think that going digital will give you free up some of those resources.
That helps us improve that.
Well, we'll be watching that when we come back to this. Mr Peter Grant, MP, to you.
Thank you, Chair. I did say I wanted to come back to customer satisfaction and complaints. Can I say at the beginning, I think we all appreciate that the nature of the service is that there's going to be quite a significant degree of dissatisfaction. You could almost argue that 50% satisfaction, because somebody will feel they've wanted 50% dissatisfaction. But the challenge, I suppose, Ms Sugden, is even within that, to be monitoring how well you're doing at serving your customers or applicants and looking for ways to improve. So within that context, if we look at the DWP customer charter, there's 4 particular areas that responses to the NAO suggested were significant concerns: ease of access to the service, getting it right, which seems pretty basic, keeping people informed and treating them with respect. What are you doing proactively and quantitatively to measure your own performance against each of those so that you can identify where the improvements are most needed?
So the department has a customer experience survey, which is the data that was in the report. Beyond that, how do we hear the voice of our customers in terms of how they feel about the service? Complaints, again, is referenced in the report. We get feedback from digital channels. There's a feedback opportunity in every digital channel. We do a lot of call listening, speech analytics as well, just to understand kind of mood and what customers are calling us about. And obviously we look at social media and get feedback from stakeholders as well. We use a lot of that insight to put in place improvement plans. So, for example, we have done a lot of, I mentioned earlier, soft skills training for colleagues, around empathy, trust, unconscious bias, things like that. We've used a lot of the insight to build into our transformation programme, and we also use it to improve how we run the service in that sense. So what going forward though, recognising we want to measure against those charter areas, we're looking at how we might do that as part of our service transformation programme, specifically those areas. And next quarter, what we're introducing, and I think Amanda Reynolds might have mentioned it previously to this committee, we are introducing what retirement services have just recently introduced on a test and learn basis, real-time customer feedback. So after a customer contacts us, they'll get a text message or an email asking why they called, rate the service as opposed to satisfaction, rate the service and areas for improvement, and that will allow us to use that insight in a far faster way rather than have a lag survey to some extent. So those are how we're building on that. But in terms of the customer charter metrics, we are working on how we will specifically measure them as part of the overarching department's transformation programme.
Given that the child maintenance service was set up to replace an agency whose customer service everyone agreed was diabolical, why has it taken so long for you to put in place a rigorous and robust method of assessing your own performance and monitoring it and possibly even publishing it? Why isn't it already in place? Why are you only now beginning to do it?
Well, I think the annual report data is actually customer survey data from 2018 and 2019. So we've had a regular customer survey which was run within the department before. It's just recently, in the last 2 years, we've moved to a customer experience survey as part of the broader department. But we've always had a customer survey that ran every quarter. And that's the data that's actually in this report.
Well, if you're putting a lot of store just now by the results of the customer service, and I know there was a change, the customer surveys, and I know there was a change in the methodology, but even allowing for that, according to the customer satisfaction survey, you haven't improved since the organisation was set up, and in fact, if anything, the trend has been slightly poorer levels of customer satisfaction. How do you account for that? If you're working so hard on an improved service, how do you account for the fact that in all that time there certainly hasn't been any evidence of an improvement, and there may have been a slight deterioration in service since your agency was set up?
So, again, I certainly wasn't part of the organisation, so can't really speak to what happened in the past. Certainly regular customer surveys have been undertaken. I would say that there's actually quite a lot of evidence that suggests the service is getting better. Compliance rates are higher. We're faster at processing things. I think the report brings out a number of things. Our accuracy is better. I think a lot of metrics point to a service that is improving. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. And I hope I've demonstrated how we're going to continue to listen to that voice and use more real-time feedback to help improve the service. Some of the aspects we've aired today are legislative, and I can't get away from that. That is the service that we're running. But all I'll commit to say is that we absolutely listen to the voice of our customer and look to try and improve that every opportunity.
So what particular legislative changes would help you to provide a better service?
Just sort of coming on to this, because paragraph 3.7 talks about some of the common areas of upheld complaints. Like took too long, got something wrong, and just to sort of, I just wanted to say two things really. One on those, there are metrics that we follow on a very regular basis in the department. So, for example, on took too long, that would relate to the build-up of backlogs and time taken to sort of action changes, for example. It's part of a dashboard that we look at within the department with the senior team and ministers on a weekly basis. It's the sort of thing we keep a very close eye on. Got something wrong, obviously the report shows how we track accuracy levels. We're now, we get things wrong 0.65% of the time, and that's a historically low level. We'd obviously want to go even further than that. But the other thing just to say, and it's not reflected in the graph, I think you're referring to the graph on page 69, but because that only goes up to 2019, but there would have been a dip in, I'm sure, people's feeling of customer service through 2020, where, as Arlene says, we did have to direct people away to universal credit claims. So some of the changes of circumstance work that we did, or we did a lot of that, but we didn't do all of it, and we didn't do all the enforcement work that we'd have wanted to do.
Through a question.
Yeah, I think we appreciate, and generally speaking, I think the wider public appreciate that from 2020 we've been in a different world, and a lot of things have had to be either scaled down or put on hold. But my question to Ms Sugden, I was quite interested that you mentioned legislative issues. Now, I appreciate that we can't ask you to give away secrets about what advice has been given to ministers or what might be in Queen's speeches, just in case there might be one coming up quite soon. But are there any particular legislative changes that would allow you and your staff to provide more consistently the level of service that you want to?
I think you've veered.
The woman in the front line. Tell us how you can. How
if it's too long an answer, you can write to us.
Yeah,
No, I think we're talking about some of the restrictions in moving forward on enforcement, the sort of processes we have to go through, or the speed at which we can move from direct pay to collect and pay, what we have to satisfy in legislation. We appreciate the legislation is there for a purpose, and we're balancing two sets of interests. And so I'm not necessarily saying that the legislation needs to change, but obviously that's something for Parliament to consider in due course. But I'm just talking about the constraints as we apply the legislation through, which balances two sets of interests all the way through. So that has we have to follow kind of due process and take account of that. But I do think the online account that we were talking about a bit earlier as part of the transformation work, in terms of people saying you don't keep me well enough informed in terms of what's going on, people will be able to see it all there on their screen. They won't have to phone up. They can just, if they we want to make this really accessible for people so that people can see their situation easily enough that way. And that, that's an example of how transformation should hopefully improve people's perception of the service.
Thank you. If we now look at sort of formal complaints that are submitted, Ms Sugden, it's quite noticeable, and the NEO have highlighted it, that relative to the number of people you're dealing with, the Child Maintenance Service and the former Child Support Agency have got very high levels of complaints going through the DWP complaints procedure, but very low numbers of those complaints being upheld. How satisfied are you that the departmental complaints procedure is getting it right, that they're upholding the things where there's a justifiable complaint and they're not upholding the things where the person's not happy with the result but they've been fairly treated?
So I'm very happy with how well we handle complaints. If anything, I would say we err on the side of customers more often than not in that sense. So, but we have a single tier complaint system, which is for the whole of the department. So it's a complaint community. So it's not just that child maintenance complaints are handled separately to other parts of the department. So I'm absolutely confident in the way that our complaints are handled and the insight we get from it.
And the upheld complaints are coming down, as the report says. In the 4 years before the pandemic, average about 3 upheld complaints for every 1,000 customers. The latest numbers are 1.15. So it's a sign of positive action.
Why is it then, if you look at the annual report of the independent case examiner, who is the next stage of complaints, not only for Child Maintenance Service but for a number of other things, first of all, again, not just proportionate to the scale, the number of complaints that they're taking up for investigation on the Child Maintenance Service and the CSA is significantly higher relative to the scale of the operation than anywhere else, and the number that's being upheld or partially upheld is dramatically different. I
think it's no different really from the complaints that are going through the department in that respect. Page 64 is, I think, quite a helpful table that demonstrates.
Yeah, Mr. Grant was referring to that earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the point, isn't it? That and it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Mr. Grant, about this is an area where people are more likely to complain because of the nature of the situation. So I think what you're seeing through the independent complaints examiner is similar. Here you see within the department 1.15. To say it's historically low, we were up around 3 in previous years. But it's still significantly higher than any other product line. All I can say is that we are. Well, I'd say 2 things. One, your point: people are more likely to complain for the obvious reasons that you've described. And then, secondly, we're doing everything we can to improve customer service, and that will, as it has already, I would see through into reducing levels of upheld complaints going forward. But I'm sure you will hold us to account.
But surely the independent case examiner, part of the benefit of that system is that they'll take into account the fact that some kinds of service by their nature attract more complaints. So they're not assessing whether the person who complains got the result they wanted. They're assessing whether the complaint they made about the way they were treated, about being kept informed and so on, as to whether that complaint is justified. And the finding that the Child Maintenance Service is much more likely to have those complaints upheld against them than other parts of the DWP. And when you set that against the fact that the DWP's own complaints process is rejecting or choosing not to uphold a much higher proportion of CMS complaints than anywhere else, the only conclusion I can draw is that something is happening within the DWP complaints process that means that it is less likely to uphold correct complaints about the CMS than it is with others. Because if you were getting it just as right in rejecting complaints about the CMS, we would see the same percentage not upheld by the CMS. The figures for the independent case examiner, the figures for the Child Maintenance Service and Child Support Agency are both 22% not upheld. For the whole DWP, it's 42%. And by the time you allow for the fact that that 42% includes the ones for the Child Maintenance Service, you're looking at a not upheld difference almost 100%. You're almost twice as likely to have a complaint not upheld if it's against anyone else in DWP than you are if it's against the Child Maintenance Service. That's not just margins of error and statistical differences. Does it not appear clear to you that there is something happening within the way the complaints are handled within the DWP that means that CMS complaints are much more likely to lead to an upheld complaint to the ICE?
But also, not sure I'm just... Well, what we're seeing in this figure sets it out is you're more likely to get... Your complaint is more likely to be upheld in child maintenance within the department than if it was universal credit, PIP, or any other service line here. It's the high... If you look at that final column, it's the highest number. So, yes, you are more likely. You know, there are more complaints in child maintenance. There are a lot of complaints in child maintenance, but even when you account for the fact that many of them are not upheld, you still have more that are upheld in child maintenance than any other service line, which means quite rightly, and you...
Secretary, numerically, yes. Certainly numerically compared to the number of people who are using the service, but 34% of closed complaints against child maintenance group were upheld, 51% for universal credit, 46% on personal independent payment. I think there's one other figure, carers allowance is the same level of upheld. Nowhere else in the department has such a low percentage of complaints being upheld. Nowhere else in the department is anywhere near such a high percentage of complaints being upheld by the time they're gone to the independent case examiner. Yeah, is it your answer that those two facts are unrelated? There's no connection between those two?
So there are two things. One is, and it goes back to your point at the beginning of your set of questions, Mr. Grant, in this situation, I would say people are more likely to complain because you've got two customers, and often, it goes back to what the Chair was saying earlier, we are acting as the judgment of Solomon on this, and in coming down in favour of one parent, you know, we're almost certainly not coming down in favour of the other parent. That is more likely to promote a complaint. We don't have any other service like that, so there will be more complaints, and I would say there will be more complaints that will not be upheld. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I say is I am not complacent on this, because when I look at the final column, I see that there are more upheld complaints for child maintenance per 1,000 customers than there are for any other service line, which means I ask myself, there are things that we know we need to improve on, and these are some of the things set out in paragraph 3.7, which I want to give the committee assurance that we are working on absolutely as we work through it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. Can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time. That's Arlene, Sugden, Peter Schofield and Hilda Massey, all from the Department for Work and Pensions. The transcript of this session will be put up on the published on the website in the next couple of days. Thank you to our colleagues at Hansard for that. And we will be producing a report likely to be after the Easter recess, given the timetable. But can I thank you very much for your candid evidence. It's good to have two new female witnesses in the room, and thank you for what you do. It's a very difficult job. We will be producing our thoughts in the hope that we help and aid your transformation for those children and parents who need support from the service, but also that non-resident parents get a fair service too. So thank you very much indeed. Order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.